So far with the arrays that we've been doing, they've all been static. So we've been stuck in such a way that we allocate the amount of spaces that we need in the array before the program starts, usually using some kind of constant. And then if we don't end up using the whole thing, we end up just having wasted space. So for example, here I might have an array that is 10 long, but I only end up putting 3 things in it maybe, and then all of this stuff to the right of it just ends up being kind of wasted and things that we could use on other variables, right? So we could have that space and use it for other things, or we could use it for other arrays or something like that. And so one way to end up fixing this is to use a vector. And so what a vector does is it only takes up the amount of space that it needs to, approximately. It might do a little bit extra, but it's never so egregious that it's like double the amount of space here that we have. And so it will resize itself to some extent over the course of the program. And so what I might do if I had a vector, so I can create a vector, I'm just going to call it v, and what we do to add to a vector is we push back. And actually I need to specify this a little bit differently. The way you specify a vector is actually using the vector word, so it's a class, which we haven't gone over, but essentially it's like a custom type written by somebody else. So, an integer and a float are kind of types here. This is a type that somebody else has written and given us access to. And so what you do is you name the vector, and then you put these little angle brackets, the less than and greater than signs basically, and then the type that you want the vector to hold. So here, I'm going to create a vector that holds integers, and the way that you put things into it is you use a pushback. And so if I was to push back 3, what this will do is it starts with no list whatsoever. So unlike an array that we've gone over before, it doesn't just allocate all the space and make the array at the beginning. It will say, okay, well, you want a 3, I will put a 3 in there. And if you want to then put another number in, so let's say I push back 7, then it will go and it will add the 7 to the end of that. So basically it's just a kind of list. In fact, it's called list in most other languages. C++ is the only one I know that calls it a vector, where it will add things onto the end as you go. So again, if I was to do one more thing here and push back another value, push back, and then put in like 4, then all it's going to do is just push another 4 onto the back of this. So what pushback does is it just adds something to the end of the list. Right? So this is good because it only really ever takes up about as much space as it needs to. So it will only make the length as long as it has to, which is good, so we don't end up with as much wasted space. And it also comes with some other nice features. So unlike the previous one where we kind of had to keep the length separate on arrays, vector, you can just do the vector, whatever the name of it is. So here my name of my vector is v dot length, and it should give you the length of the vector, so it'll tell you how many things are in it. In this case, it would tell me that there are 3 things in it. As far as getting things out of this, so you insert it by pushing into it. The way you get out of it is you simply just use it like an array. So for instance, if I was to try to get out v0, then that would be the number 3. One thing to note about this is that the insertion does not work the same way as a normal static array does. You do have to do it with pushback, and it has to do with some memory management things. Memory might just not be there if you try to do that directly because it might not be allocated yet, or it just doesn't give you access to it. So remember that when you add it, you're going to push back, and when you access things, you do it exactly the same way as you would do a normal array. And the last thing I think to mention this before we go into the program is the fact that it's strange that it's called a vector, and it's not like a math vector in any way, and it's also not like the argument vector, so they don't really have a whole lot of similarities here. The vector is named a little bit strangely in C++, but the name list is what I will usually call it, and that I think is a better name because it's really just a list of things. You just put things in order, and whenever you write something onto a list, normally you add it to the end, and that's exactly what a vector is going to do in C++. Whenever you push something back, it's just going to put it at the end of the list. Anyways, let's get into a programming example really quick. Okay, so now we're in C++. I have taken this example that we did previously, which was the array program example, and this was the extension where we simply took a bunch of names and put them into an array. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to substitute this so that we use a vector instead. One thing I forgot to mention that we should consider is that vectors aren't going to be on any sort of test for this class. This is just an extra lecture. I figure this is an important data type for everybody to know because it is very handy, and you will usually use it in 202, and in fact you will learn how to program a vector in 202 if you take that course, so I feel like it's a good idea to mention. Now we'll need to include the vector library. I don't know why it's giving me that compiler error. Let me just double check. I don't think I spelled it wrong. Yeah. For some reason this red is showing up, but my program is fine. You'll need to include the vector library in order to use it. And then, like we said, we'll need to declare a vector. So here I'm just going to comment this out, and I'm going to do a vector. So you call it a vector, and then you put these angle braces, and then you put the name of the thing that you want in the vector. So here I want a vector of strings. Remember from this example that string, it reads in a list of names, and they're all strings. So here, to replace my string array that I had, I'm just going to create a vector that contains strings. And I'll call this vector, I guess, or maybe I'll just call it name vector. So that's clear. All right, and then as far as adding things in, I'm just going to have to push them back. So this is the creation. It's replaced the declaration of the array that we had earlier. And then we had this part here where we're adding things to the array. And so rather than assign it, because again, the space might not be allocated, we're just going to do names vector. All right, I think I called it name vector. And then we push back into it. And so here, remember from this example that we were getting a line and reading it to the name. So there was a name that we're getting from file, and we were grabbing that and storing that originally in our array. If I push it back now, it will just add it to the end of our vector, however long that may be. So it's good because it will keep track of the length for you and kind of just resize as needed. Anyway, so that's how we add to it, and then the last part was how we grab them. So here I'm going to copy this line, and so here we want to use our name vector, so I called it name vector. And again, you can use it just like an array when accessing things. So if I just say name vector sub I, it will grab the ith name. Now I do need to modify this length here really quick. So I can use the name vector, and then it should have, I'm sorry, I said length earlier. I was getting this confused with C#. It's called size in C++, and it should be a function call, I believe. It's not giving me an error, so I think I'm right. And so this will grab the size for us. Let's go ahead and compile and run it, just make sure that it works. Okay, and I went ahead and ran it locally, and it does seem to work. I did have to flip something around. I realized I accidentally moved this line under the get line, but it does work. So we see it does the same thing that the array did earlier. It's just behind the scenes here, it's kind of reallocating space as needed rather than just making a bunch of waste that the other one's doing. Anyways, that was just a quick overview of vectors. It's a nice tool to have, and hopefully it helps you.